There are moments in life when the things you dream of and the reality you live in diverge so sharply that they seem to belong to two different lives. My dreams of marriage and family were like that, filled with visions of laughter, love, and the warmth of two families blending seamlessly into one. In the beginning, that vision felt so real that I thought nothing could taint it. But looking back now, I see how naive I was. How little I understood the silent power of prejudice. And how deeply family dynamics could shape not just a relationship, but a person's sense of self. I grew up in a family that valued heritage and tradition. My parents had moved to the US with nothing but a fierce work ethic and a belief in the strength of our culture. They had a simple, unspoken rule: never forget where you come from. And never lose the values that define you. Growing up, I never questioned this. I was proud of who I was and the legacy I came from. I wore my culture like a badge of honor. Something woven into my very being. A foundation that had seen generations through hardships and triumphs. When I met James, my husband, I thought I had found a kindred spirit. He wasn't from my background, but he loved my stories, my family, and even the small rituals I carried with me from my heritage. I thought his family would be the same, open and eager to embrace me as their own. For a time, I convinced myself that it would be simple, that love would override differences. But I had never met Helen. From the first time I met Helen, my mother-in-law, I sensed that she was a complex person. Someone whose emotions were locked behind layers of politeness and decorum. She was the sort who would smile and welcome you into her home, but who would observe with a watchful eye, noticing every detail, every deviation from her own unspoken standard. There was something in her gaze that unsettled me. A feeling that she saw me not as her son's partner but as an outsider. Someone whose place in her family had yet to be proven. At first, I brushed it off as a natural tension that would ease over time. I told myself that Helen simply needed time to get to know me, to see that I was a good person who loved her son deeply. I tried everything, inviting her to family gatherings, sharing parts of my life, my culture, with her. But it was like reaching out to touch fog. Every time I thought I was close to connecting with her, she seemed to retreat, leaving only a vague sense of disapproval. She wasn't overtly rude or hostile. No. Helen was far too refined for that. Instead, she wielded a sort of passive detachment, a polite indifference that slowly wore on me. It was in the small things. The way she would raise her eyebrow at certain customs I shared, or how she'd smile politely but never engage, as if my words were things to be tolerated rather than embraced. There was an underlying message in her silence: I was not like her. And because of that, I would always be slightly out of place in her world. As the months turned into years, my hope of winning her over began to fade. I would catch myself second-guessing my words around her, wondering if I had said something wrong, or if my mannerisms had somehow betrayed my background in a way that would trigger her disapproval. It became a quiet burden, a weight that pressed down on my heart and chipped away at my confidence. I began to feel as if I were walking a tightrope, trying to balance the person I was with the person I thought she wanted me to be. The strain only intensified when Lily was born. Becoming a mother was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. The love I felt for Lily was immediate, boundless, something that transcended words. She was everything to me: a bright light, a new beginning, a piece of myself that would carry on long after I was gone. I knew then that my love for her would be my guiding force, that I would do anything to protect her, to give her the life she deserved. In those early days, I held on to the hope that Helen, too, would be softened by the arrival of her granddaughter. I believed that the love we both felt for Lily would be a bridge, a shared bond that could finally bring us closer together. For a time, it seemed like it might. Helen was attentive, even affectionate in her reserved way, holding Lily with a tenderness that surprised me. I remember thinking, maybe this is it, maybe Lily is the key to uniting us. But it didn't last. As Lily grew, as she began to show the first signs of her personality, that familiar look returned to Helen's eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. There was an air of judgment in her gaze, a critical edge that sliced through my optimism. I started to wonder if Helen saw something in Lily that reminded her of me, something that confirmed In her mind, that Lily was not entirely her granddaughter but also a reflection of my background. My heritage. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was projecting my insecurities onto her. But as the months went by, it became harder to dismiss. Helen would make small comments. Seemingly innocent remarks that lingered in the air like faint traces of smoke. "She's so quiet. Isn't she?" she'd say. Or, "I wonder if she'll grow out of it." They were the kind of comments that, on the surface, seemed harmless. But to me, they were loaded with meaning. Echoes of an unspoken criticism. I started to feel the weight of Helen's expectations pressing down on me. Even in my most private moments with Lily, I began to wonder if I was doing enough. If I was somehow failing as a mother. If my background, my culture, my very identity were hindrances to my daughter's development. I found myself questioning everything. Doubting the instincts that had once felt so natural. So pure. The joy of motherhood, once bright and untainted, became tinged with a subtle anxiety. A fear that maybe, just maybe, Helen's quiet criticisms held some truth. It was a fear that would follow me, shadowing every moment, every milestone, until the day I received Lily's diagnosis. But in those early days, I was still holding on to hope. Still trying to believe that things would get better. That Helen would come to see me as her equal. Her family. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning of a journey that would test me in ways I had never imagined. A journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about family, love, and identity. As I look back on it now, I realize that my desire for acceptance, for validation, was something I had carried with me from the beginning. It was a quiet longing that I had tried to bury. Telling myself that it didn't matter what Helen thought. That my love for my family was enough. But the truth was, I had wanted her approval. I had wanted to feel like I belonged. Like my place in the family was something secure. Something I didn't have to fight for. I see now that it was this need for acceptance that made me vulnerable. That left me open to Helen's quiet judgments. Her silent disapproval. It was this desire that would drive me. Again and again. To try to prove myself. To try to prove that my heritage, my identity, was something of value. Something worthy of respect. But I would soon learn that some battles cannot be won by seeking approval. Some battles demand a different kind of strength, a strength that comes not from validation, but from within. From a deep and unshakable love. A love that no judgment, no prejudice, could ever diminish. In the end, it would be Lily who taught me this lesson. Who showed me the strength that had been within me all along. But in those early days, as I stood at the beginning of a journey I could never have foreseen, I was still searching. Still hoping for a place to belong. The first signs that something was different about Lily were so small. They almost went unnoticed. She was a quiet child. More observant than vocal. And seemed content in her own world. I cherished her unique way of seeing things. Her gentle nature. But as the months passed, I began to notice the widening gap between her development and that of other children her age. She wasn't reaching milestones as expected. Words were scarce. And her social interactions felt muted. As if a part of her was held back. Waiting for a moment that never arrived. I remember my first pangs of worry. Lying awake at night. The questions piling up in my mind, was I doing something wrong? Had I missed something crucial? My husband, James, was supportive. Though he didn't share my level of concern. He believed Lily would come into her own. That she was simply taking her time. But as a mother, I sensed there was something more. A subtle shadow behind her silence. Eventually, we consulted doctors, specialists, and therapists. Navigating a world of jargon and assessments that felt alien to me. I clung to every word. Desperate for answers. But terrified of what they might mean. When the diagnosis finally came, it was like a punch to the gut, heavy. Final. Undeniable. I was prepared for the challenges. For the adjustments we'd have to make. But I wasn't prepared for Helen's reaction. When we sat down with her to discuss Lily's diagnosis, I could see the tension in her face even before we spoke. As I explained what the doctors had said, her expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she listened. She nodded. But there was no warmth, no empathy in her gaze. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. And then she said, "Well, sometimes these things, they're hereditary. Aren't they?" The words landed like a stone in my chest. In that one sentence, Helen had reduced my daughter's identity, her challenges, to a matter of genetics. As if Lily's development was somehow my fault, a product of my background. I wanted to protest. To tell her that wasn't how genetics worked. That this wasn't about my heritage or my lineage. But the word stuck in my throat. I was blindsided by the implication that my culture, the values I held dear, could be blamed for something so far beyond my control. It was a quiet accusation. A suggestion that my heritage, the very foundation of my identity, had somehow tainted Lily. I felt an immediate, instinctive anger. A need to defend myself. To defend Lily. But I was too stunned to respond. The days that followed were a blur of emotions: grief for the dreams I'd had for Lily, anger at Helen's judgment, and a deep, gnawing guilt that began to eat away at my confidence. Every time I looked at Lily, I wondered if there was something hidden in my past, some forgotten thread in my family tree, that could explain her diagnosis. I found myself questioning things I had never questioned before, doubting parts of myself I had always held with pride. I wanted to believe that Helen's words didn't matter, that they were just one person's misguided opinion. But her disapproval lingered. A quiet, constant reminder that in her eyes, I was not enough, that my heritage, my identity, was something flawed. As the weeks passed, Helen's subtle criticisms became a constant presence, like a shadow cast over every interaction. She would say things that seemed innocuous on the surface, but each word carried an edge, a sharpness that cut deep. "Are you sure this is the best approach?" she'd say. Or, "I wonder if a different environment might help." I could feel her watching, scrutinizing every choice I made as a mother, as if she were searching for proof that I was somehow responsible for Lily's challenges. I tried to brush it off, to remind myself that Helen didn't understand, that her world was limited by her own biases. But her words found their way into my heart, turning small doubts into overwhelming fears. At the same time, I was struggling with expectations from my own family. They didn't fully understand Lily's needs, and they had their own ideas about how she should be raised. "Maybe she just needs a firmer hand," they'd suggest. Or, "Perhaps if she spent more time around other children." It was painful, hearing these well-intentioned but misguided remarks from people who loved Lily but couldn't grasp her reality. I felt caught between two worlds, isolated and misunderstood by both sides. My family's love was strong, but they didn't see the daily struggles, the quiet victories and setbacks that defined my life with Lily. And on the other side was Helen, whose criticisms seemed to grow louder with each passing day, her judgment hanging over me like a dark cloud. In moments of quiet desperation, I would imagine what life might be like if I didn't have to navigate these conflicting expectations. If I could simply be a mother to Lily without the weight of judgment pressing down on me. But I knew that was a fantasy. This was my reality, a balancing act between cultures, between identities, between the love I felt for my family and the fear that I was failing them. The isolation was suffocating. Every day felt like a battle, an endless cycle of doubt and frustration. I tried to confide in James, but he didn't fully understand. He loved Lily as much as I did, but he didn't feel the weight of Helen's words in the same way. To him, they were just words, nothing more. But to me, they were a constant reminder of the gap between us, a gap that only seemed to widen with time. There were nights when I would lie awake, my mind racing, replaying every conversation with Helen, every look of disappointment or disapproval. I would stare at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her judgment pressing down on me, suffocating me. I began to dread family gatherings, avoiding Helen as much as possible, choosing silence over confrontation. But in the quiet moments, when it was just me and Lily, I found a strange kind of peace. She was my world, my reason for fighting, And her smile, her laughter, reminded me that I was more than Helen's criticisms. More than the doubts that plagued me. I was Lily's mother. And that was a title no one could take from me. It was during one of those quiet moments that the idea of genetic testing came to me. At first, I dismissed it, telling myself that it was unnecessary, that I didn't need to prove anything to Helen. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea took root. I realized that this wasn't just about proving Helen wrong, it was about finding peace for myself. About silencing the doubts that had haunted me since the day Lily was born. So I began researching. Diving into a world of genetics and family history. Searching for answers. It was a strange mix of fear and determination. A feeling I couldn't quite explain. I was terrified of what I might find. But I knew that I couldn't keep living under the weight of Helen's accusations. I needed clarity. For myself and for Lily. The day I ordered the test, I felt a sense of liberation. A release from the doubts and fears that had plagued me for so long. I knew the journey ahead would be difficult. But for the first time, I felt a spark of hope. A sense of empowerment. I was ready to face whatever truth the test might reveal. To stand up for myself and my daughter. No matter the cost. As I waited for the DNA test to arrive, I found myself fluctuating between fear and excitement. Part of me dreaded the results. Worried about what they might reveal. But a larger part of me was eager for the truth. For a definitive answer that would silence Helen's judgment and bring me a sense of peace. When the test finally arrived, I felt a surge of nervous energy. I carefully followed the instructions. Taking each step slowly. Deliberately. As if the ritual itself held some power. The process felt surreal. Almost ceremonial. As if I were preparing to confront the past. To lay bare the history woven into my very being. Sending off the test was like releasing a burden. Letting go of the weight I had carried for so long. I knew the weight would be excruciating. That every day would be filled with doubts and fears. But for the first time, I felt a sense of control. A feeling that I was taking action. Standing up for myself and for Lily. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of anticipation and reflection. I found myself thinking about my heritage. The stories my parents had told me. The traditions we had carried across generations. I thought about the sacrifices my family had made. The struggles they had endured to give me a better life. And I realized that my heritage was not something to be ashamed of, it was a source of strength. A legacy of resilience. The waiting was more excruciating than I had anticipated. Each day, I found myself checking for updates. Hoping for answers. Yet dreading the implications. I cycled through so many emotions in those weeks: anxiety, anger, pride, and, most surprisingly, a newfound acceptance. The DNA test had sparked a journey within me. One that forced me to confront not only my heritage, but my own insecurities and desire for approval. I began to think deeply about the concept of heritage. The invisible thread that connected me to generations past. My ancestors. My culture. These were not just abstract ideas, they were part of my identity. Woven into the person I had become. I thought about my grandparents and parents. The stories they told. And the sacrifices they made. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude. For so long, I had allowed Helen's judgment to cast a shadow over my pride. I had doubted myself. Questioned my worth. And even feared that my heritage might be a burden rather than a blessing. But as I waited, I began to see my heritage in a new light. It was a source of strength. A foundation that had withstood the tests of time. No DNA test result could ever take that away. The reflection brought me clarity. I realized that my desire for Helen's approval was rooted in a deeper need to feel accepted. To belong. But as I looked into Lily's eyes, I understood that I didn't need anyone's validation to be a good mother. To love and protect her with everything I had. This was my family. My life. And I was enough. The day the results arrived, my hands shook as I held the envelope. My heart pounding in my chest. I had waited weeks for this moment. And now that it was here, I was both eager and terrified. I took a deep breath. Bracing myself. And carefully opened the envelope. The report was lengthy and filled with scientific jargon. But as I read through it, one thing became clear: There was nothing in my genetic background that could explain Lily's developmental challenges. It was a complex mix of genes. An unpredictable pattern that didn't lend itself to blame or judgment. The results were clear: Lily's condition was not a result of any flaw or defect in my heritage. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. As if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It was a validation. A reassurance that my heritage, my culture, was not to blame. But as I sat with the results in my hands, I realized that the relief was tinged with something deeper, a lingering sadness. This paper, these results, would not change Helen's views. I knew that. She might even dismiss them. Find some other way to justify her beliefs. But I also knew that this wasn't about her anymore. This was about me. About reclaiming my pride, my strength, and my identity. I decided then that I would confront Helen. Not to win her approval, but to stand up for myself and my daughter. I would make it clear that her judgments, her prejudice, had no place in our lives. I was done seeking her validation. I was ready to set boundaries. To protect my family from the shadows of her prejudice. The confrontation was not an easy one. I arranged to meet Helen alone. Wanting to have a private, honest conversation. I walked into her house with a sense of calm determination. Holding the DNA report in my hands. A tangible symbol of the truth I had waited so long to reveal. As we sat down, I could see the familiar look of guarded distance in her eyes. The polite smile that barely masked her skepticism. I took a deep breath, grounding myself, and began to speak. I wanted to talk to you about Lily, I said, my voice steady. I know that you've had concerns about her development. And I understand that this has been difficult for all of us. But I also know that you've questioned my heritage, my background, as if it were somehow to blame. Helen's face tightened. A flicker of discomfort crossing her features. But I pressed on. I held up the DNA report, showing her the results. These tests confirm that Lily's condition is not linked to anything in my heritage. This report proves that there is no genetic predisposition, no flaw in my lineage that caused this. There was a silence, heavy and tense, as Helen looked at the report. Her expression unreadable. I could see her struggling. The realization of her own prejudice dawning on her. But I didn't wait for her response. I wasn't here to debate or defend myself anymore. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that my background, my culture, is not something to be judged or blamed. It is a part of who I am. And it is a part of who Lily is. I will not let anyone, even family, make her feel like she is somehow less because of where she comes from. Helen's face softened, her posture shifting as she absorbed my words. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of something that looked like regret. A hint of understanding. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about changing her mind. This was about reclaiming my power, my pride. Without another word, I stood up, the report still in my hands, and left her house. I felt a sense of closure, a peace I hadn't known in years. I had spoken my truth, set my boundaries, and in doing so, I had freed myself from her judgment. In the weeks that followed, I focused on healing, on moving forward without the weight of Helen's criticism holding me back. My relationship with her remained polite, but distant. A necessary boundary to protect my family and myself. I no longer sought her approval. No longer felt the need to explain myself or justify my choices. I had reclaimed my sense of self. And that was enough. With each passing day, I poured my energy into nurturing Lily, embracing my heritage with renewed pride. I began to share more of my culture with her, teaching her songs and stories from my childhood, celebrating traditions that I had once kept hidden. Afraid of judgment. I wanted Lily to grow up knowing that she was loved. That her heritage was a source of strength, not shame. I started small, introducing her to the foods I had loved as a child, singing lullabies in my native language, sharing the history and stories that had been passed down through generations. I saw the joy in her eyes, the curiosity, the pride. And I knew that I was giving her something precious. Something that would carry her through life with strength and confidence. James 2. grew to understand the importance of these traditions, joining us in our celebrations and supporting me in ways he hadn't before. I could see that he was learning. That he was beginning to understand the significance of my heritage. Not just for me, but for our family. Our relationship grew stronger, built on a newfound respect and understanding. As I looked around at my family, at the life we had built, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I had faced the prejudice, the doubts, and the fears, and I had emerged stronger. I had found my voice, my strength, and I had reclaimed the pride in my identity that Helen's words had once taken from me. Lily continued to grow, to blossom in ways I hadn't anticipated. She was resilient, strong, and every day she reminded me of the power of love, of heritage, of family. She was my greatest joy, my greatest strength. And as I looked into her eyes, I knew that I had given her a foundation that no one could ever take away. Our journey had been filled with challenges, with moments of pain and doubt. But in the end, it had brought me a clarity, a sense of purpose that I hadn't known before. I had learned that family is not defined by judgment or prejudice, but by love, resilience, and the courage to be true to oneself. I had found my place, my belonging, not through acceptance from others, but through acceptance of myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could ever give to my daughter.